Um, Welcome back to the Art of Translation. I will pass around our sign-up sheet again. Make sure you sign it. And I'm very excited because tonight we can begin. On my syllabus, I promise that we will have leading and cutting-edge figures in the relatively new field of translation studies. That's what it says. And tonight I'm going to do good on that promise. I'm very glad to welcome back to the Art of Translation Dr. Elias-Bursac. She spoke here, we think it was about 4 years ago, and it was a really important and memorable lecture for me. So I was so delighted when she agreed to come back and speak to us again. I can't wait to hear how her thinking has progressed in the last 4 years. Tonight's lecture, Negotiating Meaning, what's really exciting for me is that here we have somebody who is bringing together legal translation and literary translation. Maybe not at the same moment, but somebody who is excelling in both of those two areas. And I think that that's quite a unique and an interesting combination that may be of interest to many of you. Just to give you a little bit more information about Dr. Elias-Bursac, she has been translating novels, stories, and nonfiction by Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian writers for the last 20 years. And she has also worked on the English as the English language editor of the Translation Bureau at the International Criminal Court Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So two very different areas, but I think maybe the sensibilities of both combining to in a very important way. She has translated 3 novels by David, and I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce, I'm afraid, some of these names, so correct me if I'm wrong. David al-Bahari.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Words Are Something Else, which was awarded the Atsil Award in 1998 for Best Translation from Slavic or East European Language. Gotzenmeyer, which was awarded the National Translation Award by ALTA, the American Literary Translation Association, and Snowman. She has also translated writing by Anton Shoyan, thank you. Dubravka, and then help me. Ugrisic, okay, I'm working on my pronunciation. And Slobodan Selenic, okay, thank you. And she has co-authored a textbook for the study of Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian with Ronel Alexander, and has written a study on poet Tin Ujevic as literary translator. And this is an important week. We're Monday, and on Friday, her book is going to come out. Her new book, Translating Evidence and Interpreting Testimony at a War Crimes Tribunal, Working in a Tug of War. So that is a long time in the coming, and a really important work and a huge contribution to the field of translation studies. So welcome. I'm so glad to have you back. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. And just so that everybody understands what geographic region we're talking about, Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia are in what used to be called Yugoslavia before the war of the 90s. And Yugoslavia is across the water from Italy, north of Greece, south of Austria, and west of Bulgaria and Romania. So it's just above Greece. Right above Greece, that region there, and east of Italy. And it's about 4 hours, or between 4 and 5 hours drive from Zagreb, where I lived, to Vienna and to Venice. So that just gives you a situation. And there was a terrible, terrible war there during the 90s. I'd been living there for a long time. I lived there for all in all about 18 years in Croatia, but I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I moved back just before the war broke out. My family and I moved back to Cambridge for totally unrelated reasons. Everybody there thought we knew something, but no. And I taught at Harvard in the Slavic department for 10 years, as a language instructor, and I worked on translations. And then in 1998, I went to the tribunal for a summer, and then other summers, and then a year sabbatical. And then from 2005 to 2010, I worked there for 5 years in the English translation unit. And my job was revising translations because I'd lived for a long time in the country And can everybody hear me? It's comfortable? Okay, good. And so I was with a group of 5 other native speakers of English from either, there was an Irish woman, several people from England, another American, 5 of us, different people, different times, over the some 12, 13 years that I was involved with the tribunal. And we would get the translation and then get the original and the translation on paper and hard copy and just go over them like this, looking for, I mean, most of the translators in our unit, there were 35 translators translating all the time, full-time into English, evidence for the courtroom. I was not working in the booth. Everybody thinks automatically that I was an interpreter there because the interpreters are very important to what went on in the courtroom. But I was actually working in an office on documents that were going to be tendered as evidence. And when the documents were tendered as evidence, and this is important for the things I'll be talking about, they're up on the screen in the original and the translation. And the attorneys for the defense all know the language. So if they wanted to distract the courtroom from the terrible things their client had done, one of the ways that they could do it was to complain about our translations. So I watched these discussions about translation go on in the courtrooms, and that's why I started this project. But today I want to start with something a little bit different. First, I want to talk about an interesting issue that came up with a literary translation that I recently finished. It's this novel. It's on your handout. It's the first one that's mentioned. It's called Globetrotter, and it was written during the war by David Al-Bahari, another one of his novels that just came out this year. And and the reason I want to do it is I want to introduce you to this idea of negotiating meaning, because a lot of what a translator does is figuring out how to sort of swing with the punches. I mean, you've got all sorts of things coming at you in a text, and you have to figure out how to respond to them. And I just want to tell you one anecdote that I heard somebody from Belarus, a poet from Belarus named Valzhina Mort, give a talk at Harvard a few months ago. And she made a wonderful point, which is that in English, the phrase lost in translation is a dactyl and a trochee. So it sounds poetic, lost in translation. And that means we like it as a phrase. She said in other languages, it's not a dactyl and a trochee. It's just a dumb little sentence that doesn't have any poetic thrust. So it's boring. And we don't talk about it, she said, in other countries and in other languages. All this business about discussing what's lost in translation just doesn't interest us that much. So I wanted to say that in my work and the things that interest me, I'm interested in other things than figuring out what was lost or obsessing about that. I think about strategies, and I think about power in translation and the position that a translator is in relationship to the people they're translating, the people they're translating for. So just briefly regarding what came up with this book, Globetrotter, it was written by Al-Bahari. He left Serbia and went to Canada and lived in Calgary for many years during the war. And while he was there, he wrote several Canadian novels. And this one takes place in Banff, which is a beautiful place in the Canadian Rockies, where there's an arts center. And David Al-Bahari, actually went to the arts center and then later wrote the novel, sort of a murder mystery that takes place at the art center. And there are 3 main characters. A writer whose name is Daniel Atias, the same initials as David Al-Bahari, who's come from Serbia and is there. He's Jewish and he's from Serbia, just like David Al-Bahari, and he's there for a brief visit as a fellow. The narrator in the first person is a Saskatchewanian painter. And then a third guy is somebody from Croatia. They sort of get to know. And the entire novel revolves around 2 things that are never made explicit anywhere in the novel. One of them is that the painter is obsessed with the writer from Serbia and never really says that he's gay, but it sort of just permeates everything, and it's just this kind of unspoken presence throughout the entire book. And he's always talking about presences and absences all during the narrative. And the other thing that is the other elephant in the room that just goes right through the novel is this issue of Serbian guilt for the wars in the 1990s, the Serbian aggression and all the terrible things that happened in that part of the world as a result of Milosevic's policies. And he never says it explicitly, but all during the novel he circles around it in various ways. And of course, when it was written in Serbian, Serbian readers are always thinking about Serbian guilt. I mean, this is something everybody, it's like being in Germany after World War II. People think about, it's just a focus of everybody's attention. So how does this writer come down? Does this writer think we're all guilty, or does he think we're not guilty? And sort of try to read that in between the lines of anything that is published. So this is as close as he comes to actually speaking about Serbian guilt. He just, because the other fellow, this Ivan Matulic's grandson, who never is given a name, he just is referred to always as Ivan Matulic's grandson, his grandfather, it turns out, was a war criminal, a Croatian war criminal in World War II. And so Ivan Matulic's grandson, Ivan Matulic was this war criminal, and his grandson is telling them stories about how he figured out that his grandfather was a war criminal. And he is mortified and horrified by what his grandfather did. And Daniel Atias finds this very inspiring, that somebody is willing to take the blame for what happened in World War II. And so obviously you're thinking he's then saying, well, so I find it exciting to contemplate taking the blame for what the Serbs have done, but he never says this. So this is as close as he gets. What Ivan Matulic's grandson has shown me, said Daniel Atias, is especially precious as a confirmation that there can be no remorse until one admits to one's own guilt. A stark contrast to the demands being heard from all over his former country that there can be no repentance of one side until the other or a third party or however many confess to their culpability. And in the process, he said, there was no talk of one's own guilt or responsibility because the premise was the certainty, he said, that there was no guilt at all to be borne by whichever party was speaking. So, he said, where he came from in his former country, it turned out that no one in their own eyes bore any blame. Sartre had put it that hell is always other people. Ivan Matulic's grandson, he said, was the first person who, one way or another, had offered something different, meaning that he had shown the readiness when he said hell to point to himself. So that's as close as he comes. But he never comes out and says, Daniel Atias says, finally I understand now that the Serbs are to blame for what happened in the war. So when you have an author that creates this artistic kind of structure of the entire novel about not saying something, and then the publisher asks you to write an afterword for the book, do you put it in there or not? And this is what I struggled with. And so I decided not to, because he'd made such an effort not to say it, that it seemed crude to be stuffing words in his mouth, almost aggressive, that how could I do this to my writer? So I didn't. I went to Banff on a fellowship for 3 weeks and translated the novel about Banff that he had written, and he came and spent a week with me there. And that's what I wrote about in the afterword, was our interaction during this time and how wonderful it was to spend time with him and our relationship as a translator and a writer and so forth. But this bothered me, and it stayed with me, and I worried about it, that an American just wouldn't be attuned to these sorts of things, and yet if they were aware of them, they might be interested in them. And so I was torn. So finally, when the publisher was doing the cover copy, they asked me what I should do, and here on the flyleaf, I had them put this sentence in. In Globetrotter, al-Bahari deals with the bewilderments of exile and lost identity, themes he has investigated in earlier works, but in this unsettling experimental book, he also enters new arenas where sexual identity and the nature of blame and guilt attract his scrutiny. And I just felt I have to say it somewhere. It has to be clear that that's what this book really is about, but I don't have to say he's saying the Serbs were wrong for the war. I don't have to spell it out, because that would just be so wrong in the context of the novel that I couldn't bring myself to do it. And I don't know if I was right. I can never read this novel as if I didn't know anything about it, because I know every word. So I can't tell whether, in fact, what I did was the right thing to do. But it's an example of negotiating, and there's the publisher and the author and you, and what's so different. I mean, there are many things that are different about being a literary translator and working as a reviser at the War Crimes Tribunal. But one of the biggest things that's different is that the audiences are so dispersed when you're a literary translator. You work in your living room, in your armchair, as I do, listening to jazz and working on my translation. And then I send it to the publisher, and after a few months, the editor gets back with some comments. And then it comes out, and maybe there's some reviews or whatever, but it all just kind of drifts. It's very unconnected. You don't have that immediacy, whereas in the courtroom, there they are, grousing about your translation and revision right there, and the whole process is condensed down so you can see it very clearly. And that's why I wanted to write about what goes on with translation and interpreting at the War Crimes Tribunal, because it's so visible and so interesting to actually see it all sort of concentrated that way. So I'll take you through a little bit of an introduction to the tribunal as an institution. It's now getting ready to shut down, so it's much, much smaller than it used to be. But, and first of all, just a few words about this. This is on the cover of my book, but I just love it. It's from 1300 BC, and this is Horemheb, who was a pharaoh after Tutankhamun. And those are his subjects, and you can see that they have all different headdresses. So they're from different parts of the Egyptian lands. So there's people who are more maybe sort of Abyssinian, or people who are more Mesopotamian, and it's just sort of all the different sort of African versus Middle East and so forth. And then this is one translator, an interpreter, looking first this way and then that way and interpreting between them. And it's one of the oldest representations of an interpreter, or certainly that we're aware of. So I just think it's it's in Leiden at the Museum of Antiquities. And I just really love it as an example of a translator within a relationship between power and people. And I think we're always working in that relationship, but we don't always see it quite so clearly as you can see it here or you can see it at the tribunal. So when I say negotiating meaning, well, I'm not going to get to that. Let me do the ICTY first, this part. So the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, was set up in 1993, and it's still going on, so quite a long time, now 23 years. When they started out, nobody had any idea that it was going to last for very long. It was really sort of thought of as a Band-Aid idea, like we'll do this symbolic thing, we'll set up this tribunal, we'll pretend to do something, but then we won't have to put any feet on the ground. You know, we don't have to send in troops. So this war was brewing, terrible things were happening. There were concentration camps, people starving to death. 100,000 people ended up being killed and so forth. So they said, no, we're just gonna set up this thing and it'll look good on paper. And so they set it up, but then they hired all these judges and investigators who were really earnest, and they made it work. It's really an interesting story, actually. So they indicted 161 people for what they considered to be war crimes, alleged war crimes. And all of them were brought in. Now, this tells us a lot of things, but what it mostly tells us about is that there were big countries involved, and the former Yugoslavia were small countries, and they were susceptible to pressures and so forth. But it took a long time, and the last fugitive was only brought in about 4 years ago and is still on trial. So during that time, of all those trials that they had 146 of those individual indictees have had their trials have been completed. There are 15 cases still ongoing, 4 on trial, 11 awaiting appeal. And these are the results of the trials. 79 so far of the 146 were sentenced, 18 acquittals, 36 indictments because somebody died or because there were procedural issues and they had to they either tainted evidence or whatever, and they couldn't proceed with the trial. And 13 were referred to national jurisdictions, so the people were tried in Bosnia or Croatia or Serbia. Just a few. They were hoping that there'd be more, and that did not, unfortunately, work very well. So at its peak when I was there were about 1,300 staff, maybe as many as 1,500 staff. That was in like in about 2005, 2006. That's when the tribunal was at its peak. And I went over there in 2005 and was there for 5 years during that time. And so you had your trial chambers with judges from all over the world, really just all over the world. You had your administration, which was running the detention unit, the prison where the indictees were kept while their trial was ongoing, the legal aid unit to provide support for those indictees who were indigent and couldn't support themselves, couldn't pay for their lawyers. Almost none of them could pay for lawyers. The very few of them were really rich to begin with, and besides, these are lawyers who were charging, $400 an hour or something. I mean, there was no way. So most of them got support from the tribunal. Victims and witnesses unit to bring victims in, house them while they were testifying, see them out, and protect them in various ways. If somebody wanted to change their identity or something after they testified, they would take care of that. Court management is things like the screens in the courtroom, the recording, all that sort of thing, because they recorded everything. And the booths, they had English and French interpreters translating into English and French and into the languages of the accused of that trial and of the witnesses of the trial. Lots of interpreting going on, lots of technology and so forth. So that was what court management is mostly dealing with. And then the language services, where I worked, English translation unit, French translation unit, and the conference interpreting unit. Those are the three major parts of the language services. And there were about 150 people working in the language services. Then you have the Office of the Prosecutor with teams for each trial, which included investigators and attorneys. And they would investigate and build up a case, and then they'd take it to court. Investigations ended in just over 10 years ago. And then there were defense teams for each trial. All of this went on in 3 buildings, 2 of which were right next to each other and a third a little further away. The defense teams had their offices elsewhere. They weren't actually in the building with the judges and the attorneys for the prosecution. So it's a big operation, as you can imagine, in The Hague, in the Netherlands, in Holland, just across the water from England, right on the English Channel there on the North Sea. So here you have the conference language services section where I worked, the languages, and you had the conference interpreters, 60 to 80 at maximum time, and then other people would come in on contract for crunch times when there were a lot of trials going on, working in all these different directions, all these languages into English and French into those languages and French into English. Different booths, and I'll show you the courtroom in a minute, what it looks like. The English translation unit, that's where I worked. We did both court documents, which are things like indictments and judgments that the tribunal itself was issuing, its own decisions, and then also documentary evidence, as I said, the evidence that was being tendered in trials. And most of the evidence was documentary evidence, and we'll talk lots more about that. And these were the languages that these were working into, and English, French into Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, English, French into Albanian and Macedonian. There were trials run in, with Albanian accused and with Macedonian accused, but most of the accused were Bosnian, Croatian, and or Serbian. And then you had the French translation unit, which was much smaller. You can see that they don't do evidence. It just was clear very soon that there were going to be millions of pages of evidence translated, and it didn't make sense to have all the translations into both French and English, even though there were francophone chambers with judges who were running their their cases in French, and anglophone chambers where the trial was being run in English. But the francophone judges agreed that they'd be happy to receive translations in English because they could read the English, but they didn't want to run the trial in English. So, and there were many fewer French cases than there were English cases, but there were important ones. So what the French translation unit did exclusively has been doing is to translate all sorts of English documents that the court produces into French, indictments, judgments, from those Anglophone trials. If a judge was running a trial in English, all of the documentation, all the submissions, all the different paperwork that went on was all in English. All that was translated into French. And why English and French? Well, it's kind of a question of international law. And it's partly just a tradition. It's partly colonialism, because you had the French colonial system had one legal system, and the Anglo colonial system had a different legal system. So this means you can bring in judges and attorneys. If you say that you use English and French as your main languages, it gives you a really wide reach. You've got all of Africa, or most of Africa, and a lot of other continents that you can bring in as a result of having the English and the French and these different legal traditions. And it did make for all kinds of complications having both the Anglo-American system of justice or legal system and the French and the continental legal system, which are very different. And the role of the judge is very different. And that created all kinds of issues for the courtroom, especially in the first years until they sort of worked out a hybrid, what they referred to as the hybrid system. So people always ask me, well, when somebody's convicted, where do they go to serve their time? So this is an old map that I found. I couldn't find a more recent one, but this gives you an idea mainly of the countries where people go. I don't think there's anybody serving time in the United States. It's all European countries of one sort or another. And you have to realize that this is Albania, this is Ukraine, I guess that it must be the Czech Republic and Poland, and The light blue means that they've offered their services, but that nobody is actually serving time in those jails. But there are people serving time in all these jails. And one of the bizarre things that people really hadn't thought about at all, especially for the Bosnian Serb convicts, is that they would go to serve in, say, England or France, and there'd be lots of Bosnian Muslim people doing time in the jails in England and France who were not happy with what these people had done in their countries. So it was kind of tricky for them in the jails. It was dangerous. Sometimes they'd have to be isolated and stuff, because that was a whole other piece of it that nobody had really thought about until that they actually started serving their time. So here's one of the 3 courtrooms. There are 2 big ones and a smaller one. This was an insurance company building that they made over into the main building of the tribunal, and it was kind of an exercise in sort of creating these very modern courtrooms. So I don't know if you can see that, but these are computer screens, and every person in the courtroom has one, and then on it they'll see the texts in Croatian and English or Bosnian and English, or in front of them when they're, so this is where the judges sit. This is where the witness sits facing the judges. The defendant, Mr. Milosevic or whoever else, is just sitting right there with guards around him. Only one woman, so I'll always refer to them as men because there was only one woman. She pled guilty and didn't have a trial, so we can justifiably refer to them all as men. And the defense attorneys over there, and on this side of the courtroom are the prosecution attorneys, the teams. And this is a bulletproof glass wall, and behind it is the gallery where you'd be sitting if you go there and watch a trial. There's not much going on right now, but you can look at the schedule. If you're in Holland, it's a 45-minute train ride, even less, 25 minutes from the airport in the Netherlands, and you can go, and all you have to do is just show an ID, and they let you in, and you can watch part of a trial. The photograph is taken from the interpreter booths, and over there are the other interpreter booths, and that's where people sit and do the interpreting, and everybody has headphones, and everybody in the courtroom is listening to the headphones all the time, because almost always the witnesses were speaking local languages of the Balkans, the judges were speaking either English or French, the attorneys were speaking English or French or one of the languages of the Balkans, and so everybody was all listening to interpreting all the time, and as they were listening to what everybody was saying in all the different languages, they were discussing translations. So they're discussing translations while they're listening through interpreters, and it gets very complicated, but surprisingly functional. So on to the negotiating of meaning piece, and I just want to show you some of the disputes that we had and debates that we had from different perspectives. There was the perspective of the translators and the things that we felt strongly about. There was the perspective of the prosecution, and when they would push for something one way or another, then the defense had other goals, and they would use translation and interpreting disputes for their own purposes. And the judges would come in and they would have a perspective. So there were lots of different perspectives and different sort of pushes going on from different sides. I wanted to illustrate some of those in these examples. So the first one is that when the country broke up into small pieces with the beginning of the war in 1990, sometimes there'd be this little territory that was set up, a little like the 13 states, the beginning of the, in the war against England. So they'd set up this little territory and they'd create a little provisional government, and then they'd start issuing documents. This is important, this is what we're gonna do, this is who we are. And the documents would be signed by whoever had, with the self-styled president of this little functioning unit. And we would see time and time again that these people would refer to themselves as the predsjednik vlade, which means the prime minister. And they were a prime minister of a place that was like a county, maybe 2 counties, possibly 3 counties, but not a very large area. And all my colleague translators hated this. They did not want to put prime minister under this person's name. They just felt it was sort of a sacrilege, come on, who are you? You self-styled prime minister. So, because the phrase in Bosnian and Croatian and Serbian is predsjednik vlade, which means president of the government. But in many European countries, that's the phrase that's used for the prime minister, president of the government. And if you see it as president of the government in Bosnian. You're supposed to translate it as prime minister, not president of the government. But this was the compromise that my colleagues found they would fall back on, and they just would do it literally as president of the government, because they could not bear to call that person, to sort of deem them a prime minister, as if by their words they were making that person even more important than they deserve, much more important than they deserve to be. And this came up in the courtroom, and you'll see here the indictment for Milan Babic, who was in this relationship to a small Serbian area within Croatia. And so it says, on April 30th, 1991, Milan Babic was elected president of the Executive Council, and he became prime minister / president of the government of the self-declared SAO Krajina. They couldn't decide which to use, so they just put them both in with the slash and figured, this way we're qualifying prime minister so that it's clear that it isn't like David Hume or something, but some guy who thinks he's a prime minister. So, and the courtroom said, we don't want extraneous annotation. It is up to us to decide in the courtroom, the lawyers to argue and us to adjudicate about the meaning of terms. So the translators should not be gatekeepers that way. You shouldn't be deciding what it's going to be, which is an interesting statement, because we have to decide all the time. We have to make choices all the time in our texts. But this was a case where it was the bias of the translators was preventing them from just putting the words prime minister down, because they were so angry about these people and their arrogance. And so that ended up, when we finally settled, we decided, no, we have to just put prime minister. And in fact, it'll look so ridiculous that they'll be shooting themselves in the foot anyway to have that under their name. We don't have to worry too much. They're just going to look stupid. So don't worry about it and just put prime minister. And it was this early on, it was very early in the work of the tribunal that this came up, and it was kind of a learning experience for everybody to sort of say, okay, we'll let the court do it. There were early translators, especially people, I knew several people from Sarajevo who had come out of Sarajevo. There was a big siege in Sarajevo that lasted for 4.5 years. It was a horrible, horrible thing. And they were very angry. And when they came and they saw things in texts that they felt they wanted to make sure everybody understood what they meant, they wanted to footnote everything. And the judges said, no footnoting, no footnoting. It's up to us to figure these things out. That's what the courtroom is for. You can't tell us what these things mean. So this was all about our role of how much we were going to tell and how much we were going to explain or not. Now, in the article that I gave to Carolyn to distribute to all of you, I go into a lot of detail about this number 3, asanatia. And if you've already read it, you'll know that. And if you haven't, then you'll have a chance to read it after my talk. But I just wanted to explain very briefly that this was a prosecution strategy. So the prosecution found this word that didn't translate very well into English for a number of reasons. We just didn't have a handy term for it. And they would use it in cross-examination of officers from the Republika Srpska army, saying, okay, but what does that mean? But what does that mean? But what does that mean? And how do you translate it? Come on, how do you translate it? And it created really interesting problems for the people in the booth, because as they said the words, he would say, the cross-examining attorney, or he or she would say, so, sir, asanatia comes up in this document of yours, and how would you translate it? What does it mean? So the interpreter is saying, asanatia came up in this document, how do you translate it? What does it mean? And then the man is groping around trying to think of all the different ways to describe what it means, and the interpreter is translating all these different ways, and each time he looks for another synonym, the interpreter has to come up with yet another way of saying the same thing. So we had a whole arsenal of these phrases that could be used for the interpreters when these debates went on, and they went on in trial after trial. It's a very important word for a whole series of trials related to the Srebrenica massacres. And the reason that it's such an important word is because it was used to signify, it was used as a code word for a cover-up for hiding bodies after massacres. And they wanted to find out where the massacres had happened and what had gone on in the massacres, and so they would poke at the witnesses to get them to talk more about what they were actually doing on their asanatia teams when they were supposedly going and just clearing up a battlefield after a battle, which is a regular activity, but in fact they were involved in the irregular activity of mass graves and burying thousands of people. And you can see in trial after trial, people would come and define it. So I just additional to that article, because I came across these things later, I added in from a Croatian trial. So this wasn't, the other ones were all Bosnian and Serbian trials where it came up, but it also comes up in a Croatian trial. That's number 3. And it's defined as criminal investigation technicians, sanitization teams, coming from the police to identify persons, keeping records, medical team for immediate medical assistance, explosive experts. It's to clean up an area where a battle has been fought after the battle so that it's possible to resume life in that area where people have been living. But it's also about hiding bodies. You know, if you're the winning army that after a battle and you come in, you're the one who gets to choose how much you say about how many bodies you found on your little piece of territory that you've just won and what you're going to do with them. And so the Nazi teams are always involved in some kind of a cover-up. I mean, it's very unlikely that, that anybody would ever be completely honest about how many bodies they found, or if somebody was still alive and they killed them or whatever. And yet, after years and years of redefining this word and redefining this word in trial after trial, here's Mladic's trial in 2013. He's one of the last fugitives to be brought in. And again, he had a witness come in and say, the defense counsel put it to him that the bodies of those who'd been killed in the fighting were buried in those graves during the terrain clear-up operation. It was a regular procedure after a fight to collect, remove, and bury the bodies of those who'd been killed in action. And again, they're denying that it's a cover-up for a massacre, even after all that debate in the courtroom. So it's an interesting thing that there's never a definitive moment when somebody says, okay, well, there were some, but far too few definitive moments where somebody said, okay, Nazi means this, and it implies this. It was always, no, it wasn't a massacre, it wasn't a massacre. Really, that never happened. Martians. So number 4 is an interesting situation that came up. It was a much less important word, stacionar. Or no, actually, it's number 3 here. What did I do? Did I insert one else in there? Oh, I see, I had the different because of the art literature quote. So stacionar is a word that means, in all dictionaries that we were able to find, it means a medical facility like an infirmary. It's not a hospital, it's a temporary sort of place that, like in a school or in a business, where you might go lie down if you're not feeling very well, and there might be a nurse there who could say, well, you really should see a doctor, and send you off to see a doctor. But it's maybe a bed and a thermometer and some aspirin sort of thing, just a room somewhere. And that's what stacionar almost always means. And it came up, as you can see in this quote, during the testimony of somebody concerning the proper translation of the word stacionar in an exhibit. That means a document that we had seen. And it was a map. The document was a map. And it showed buildings that were targets for the Croatian army. And each building had a name for what it was. It was a church or a school. They weren't all, the churches weren't targets in schools. But anyway, so that all these different buildings. And then there was this building, and it said stacionar. So we wrote the translation in on the place where that it was I think a medical station. And this caused a great deal of consternation in the defense, because they didn't want to make it look as if the Croatian army was training its staff to shoot at medical facilities. That's contravening the Geneva Conventions and all sorts of things, and so bad idea. So they got very huffy about this. Even though the document wasn't important, it referred to something that had happened years before the events that were being discussed in the trial. But this was just casting aspersions on the Croatian army and its procedures. And so the defense objected strenuously. So this is the prosecution. There were submissions sent to our unit and to the judges saying why this word should be translated one way or another. And the prosecution in this first submission is saying the trial chamber should therefore accept the existing translation as accurate, as the attached material makes clear all authoritative bilingual reference sources translate the word stacionar as a medical station, inpatient clinic, or similar term. So that was the prosecution pushing what they wanted the translation to be like. The defense then gave a submission to the court in which they said they disagree with the prosecution's submission. The word stacionar was not correctly translated as medical station. It is not the case that all authoritative bilingual reference sources translate the word stacionar as medical station, inpatient clinic, and so forth. Although that, in fact, it's not true that I hadn't seen a single one, and we went through many dictionaries, and they were all in agreement. Well, we wouldn't back down. The court came to us. What happens in these, when there are these disputes, is that they would go to the judges, these submissions, the prosecution, the defense would make their submissions. The judges would look at the submissions, and then they'd come to us, our 5 of us, the language experts, and say, okay, what do we do now? Which is right? What do you say? And we were autonomous. So we really fought for our autonomy in very energetic ways every day. And we said, we asked around. I was sort of in charge of this at the time. So I went around and I said to people, so stacionar, colleagues of mine in my unit, people who'd served in the army. I said, do you think stacionar could ever be anything but a medical station? Every dictionary says medical station or infirmary. And one of them said, well, I could imagine a situation where people would call a kind of a barracky place where you might lie down to take a nap in between your shifts. If you're in the military and you're tired because you've been up all night on duty and you've got to lie down, they might call that a stacionar. It's not in the dictionaries, but you'd find it in usage. So we took that on board, we talked about it, and we decided that it was an ethical issue. And if there was any suspicion that this building could be a medical facility of some kind, and it was on a target map, we had to translate it as medical facility. And if the defense could prove that it was otherwise, that's what the courtroom was for. They could bring in witnesses if it was important. They could say, I stood in front of that building. That was just a place where soldiers lay down and took a rest between shifts. So we pushed, and they didn't like it. The judges didn't like it because it left them at the mercy of the disputes on both sides. The defense and prosecution didn't like it because it wasn't settled. And finally, the defense decided the strategy was to make fun of it as a word and make it into a joke. And so in about 3 different times over several weeks, there'd be timing things come up, but when are we going to be done with this? Well, luckily the word stacionar doesn't appear in those texts, so we'll get through them quickly, they'd say. And they say, we can be assured of one thing, there's no stacionar in the transcript anywhere, so we don't have to worry about that, and the judge says that saves us at least 2 weeks. So that became this standing joke, and they diffused it by making it into a joke so that it could no longer be taken seriously as a document. And that was the way they dealt with it, because it wasn't hugely important for the case. It was something that wasn't relevant to the actual fighting. But we just stood our ground and we wouldn't budge. And then you have rukovodzenie, and I'm just going to talk about this briefly, but this was a very big issue for the defense. Anybody know Slavic languages here? So what is ruka? It's a hand. So rukovodzenie means hand guiding, and in the business world it means management, and in the military world it means the control part of command and control. And there's this phrase, command and control. You may have heard of it. It's very common in the military, and what it means is that a commander gives out commands, and then there's staff all along the different levels, the divisions, the units, the different sizes, I forget them all, the brigades, the squads, or whatever, and they're positioned to make sure that that order is implemented by each of those units in a reliable way that is following what the original order is supposed to do. So they're in the control structure, in the command structure, are the people who actually issue the orders. So a lot of the defendants who were referred to by their job description as being part of the control structure tried to pressure the translation unit to change that word to management from control or command or direction or something. We had a variety of words for it. And because they felt management would somehow be less responsible. If you're maybe how many paper clips on each desk, or to fix somebody's computer or something, and not going out and murdering people in villages. So this was an issue. This was a document that our unit published relatively early on in the tribunal, to deal with this question of rukovodzenie and how to translate it. And we gave all kinds of possible words for it. We list the different dictionaries and how they translate it. Benson translated as manage, run, direct, operate. Buyas as management, leadership, guidance, handling, control. Jack Jones in military context as control and directing combat operations. And it's part of the syntagmum of command and control. So in a military context, the word rukovodzenie is usually translated as control, although it can be translated as direct, like to direct a campaign or direct an action or something like that. And even though we issued this in 2005, it continued to be a problem until that Mladic trial that I quoted from a minute ago in 2013. And people had wasted so much time in the courtroom discussing the meaning of this word that by this time it was possible to get the defense and the prosecution together, and they made a lexicon of terms that come up frequently, and they agreed on the definitions with the language unit, and they published it, and that was how people translated it. And after that there weren't any more discussions, but it took 20 years for them to get to that point. And then the last issue is perhaps one of the most interesting one in a lot of ways. It's something you might not think about, but in, of course, military documents of the kind that we were revising, and I should just tell you a little bit about what those documents were. They're reports from the field of a military unit. So the 3rd Drina Corps is sending in every 4 hours what's happening with their unit, how much ammunition they still have left, has anybody been hurt, or it might not be 4 hours, maybe once a day, or even once a week if not very much is happening in their region. But we translated and revised thousands and thousands of pages of these military reports from military units. So they would refer to the enemy in various derogatory ways. That's what happens in wars. People use words to dehumanize their enemies so that their soldiers won't feel quite so horrible about killing them. So, and then we also translated a lot of things like meetings. There'd be minutes from meetings or just recordings, transcripts of meetings, and we would translate all those. And you can imagine in meetings people get heated and they use derogatory language to talk about the people they see as their enemy. So we had a lot of derogatory language in texts. Now, if you have, like there's a word Chetnik, it means, it comes from World War I actually, and it refers to Serbian fighters, and it was used often to refer derogatorily to Serbian fighters. That word is in the dictionary because it goes way back and people have used it for a long time. We didn't annotate that because we had this, the judges saying don't annotate, so we figured if they want to find out what it means they can look it up in a dictionary. It's in English dictionaries, that's no problem. But there were lots of words that nobody would understand if they saw them, so we couldn't leave them in the text. But if we translated them as, like if you have kraut for a German as a sort of colloquial way of referring to Germans during war, and then you just say German instead of kraut, you've lost in the text all of the nastiness that was in the text and the attitude of the person who was writing the text towards that population. So this was a quandary for us. How do you do it? And we'd been told not to annotate. So we negotiated with the judges and we said we would like to annotate these words as follows. So if you have, Balia is a terrible word for Bosnian Muslim, and it came up all the time in Serbian troops using it. And if there's anybody here from Bosnia, I apologize because it is a nasty word. But anyway, there you have it. So with that, we would leave it Balia in the original, B-A-L-I-J-A, italicized, as you often do with foreign words and translations. And then after that, in slashes, we'd say derogatory for Bosnian Muslim, the first time it appeared in a text. And after that, we just left it Balia, always italicized in the text. And we did that consistently, and nobody ever had any problem with that because everybody understood that Balia is a really ugly thing to say for Bosnian Muslims. It's a very offensive term. Sheepdar, however, is a much more complicated term. And it is the derogatory term used for Albanians living in Kosovo. In Serbia in particular, they use it for Albanians living in Kosovo. But it's complicated by the fact that it also is derived from the real word for Albanians in Albanian. What I usually like to say is it's like girl. Like if a bunch of women say, let's us girls go out for a drink, that's fine. But if the boss comes into the room and says, girls, would you type this up for me? That's not fine. And it's very much that same sort of thing where it just turns and suddenly in somebody else's mouth it's no longer appropriate. And there's history to it, which is that in 1968, Tito banned the use in public discourse of sheepdog and said that Albanac, or Albanian, would be used always in education, in the media, anywhere in public life, never sheepdog. And it was only when the war began that it began to creep back into the newspapers in Serbia and into the public discourse arena, and it wasn't stopped by the politicians. So we had an interesting situation even in the translation unit, which is that the younger members of our translation unit had been young enough when it wasn't being used that they didn't remember that. And they, because Milosevic had been actually conducting a dehumanizing campaign against the Kosovo population for a long time. So they were just used to it. And to them it wasn't derogatory. And they said, how can you know each time someone uses that word they intend to offend? It's just a normal word in Serbia. And then in the courtroom, the biggest problem was that in the courtroom, it kept coming up again and again. And we would do the same thing as we did with Balija, sheepdot in italics, and then in slashes, derogatory for Albanian. But then the witnesses from Serbia would see derogatory for Albanian. They'd say, that's not derogatory, that's the same word the Albanians use for themselves. That's just a normal word. So it got to be really, the judges came to us. There were only a few trials where there were a lot of Albanian speakers testifying and where there was talk about Kosovo and so forth. And the judges came to, contacted us from one of these trials and said, look, we have had almost every day discussions about whether Shqiptar is derogatory or not in our courtroom with witness after witness after witness. And by now we're very familiar with all the arguments. And you don't have to inform us of these things anymore. Could you please do this differently, because it's taking up too much time in the courtroom and it's just crippling these trials. We're having these constant discussions about this. So we discussed it among ourselves and we could not reach a consensus. And finally, we agreed, and everybody did it, that we would leave it Shqiptar in italics so that it was marked language and it wasn't just neutral language like Albanian. And in slashes just say Albanian. So it was like an alternate term for Albanian. And the judges knew that it was derogatory and they understood the complexities of the argument and they agreed to that. So we made these compromises sometimes with the judges. We had to work with them because they had to read 5 to 10 to 20,000 pages of evidence for every trial. And it didn't seem fair to clog them up with stuff that was just going to make their lives miserable, as long as they fully understood the issues that we were concerned about. And these, I'm not going to read through these, but you have examples of the discussion about Shqiptar going on in the courtroom and different trials in 2005, 2006, and 2009. So you can see that this was an issue that kept coming up time and time again. And after we changed that and said Shqiptar Albanian, there were no more problems in the courtroom and they stopped having quite so many discussions about it, and the judges said it's been resolved and we were done. But so these are just some examples of the ways that the prosecution or the defense or the judges interact with the translators, and how we worked so hard to maintain our autonomy and to have the last word and to decide if we were going to compromise, we would compromise on our own terms. If we were going to stick to something, we would stick to something and we would be able to defend it. If they required of us to produce a written document of why we'd made a certain choice, we had to be able to produce that document and say, these are the dictionaries that use this, or this is the reasoning behind our choice of this, and that it would go into the documentation of the trial. So that's basically what I wanted to cover. I mean, there's so many more things I could talk about. And I'll just leave you with my favorite line from this book project, which I just finished, which was a translator was actually asked to testify. And I should say that after about 2 or 3 times when language people in the language services were asked to testify, they put a ban on tribunal, ICTY translator staff testifying, because they felt it could be a form of intimidation in this question of autonomy, making us stand up there and, going on tape, discussing whatever. The first time, let me just describe a few of these times because they're interesting, why people did testify early on. There was one case where there'd been, does anybody remember carbon copy, what it really means? So it's a piece of black paper impregnated with, I think, graphite or something between 2 pages, and then you have a document typed and there's a copy, and the copy comes through because it's typed on a typewriter, which actually hits the paper and makes the imprint on the other page. So this was a copy of a document where there had been some typing but no carbon copy was there, so you could see the indentation of the letters but no ink. And so my colleague who was translating it read that it was a name, somebody's name, in fact, the name of the man who was on trial. And she added that into the translation in slashes, because whenever we added something in that wasn't visible, we would, any comments that we had, limited as they were always in backslashes, because parentheses are used in regular text, so we needed to keep them so they could be just used in the translation, and the slashes were our addition. And so she commented on it in some way, like partially illegible or something, and then wrote the name. So she was called to testify. Did anybody tell you to write this name? Could you see this name clearly? Well, partially clearly, and so forth. And she just testified as that. But after a couple of times of people testifying on sort of similar things about just the credibility of a document, the judges put a stop to it and said they didn't want our staff testifying. But they did bring in other interpreters and translators who'd worked during the war in the field as translators and interpreters, and they were being brought in to usually talk about things they'd seen and heard. Often interpreters would go with an important person to a meeting, and they'd sit next to that person and translate for them, and so they would sometimes be brought in to testify about what happened at the meeting because they were there. And so this man was being asked to testify. He'd been a field interpreter between a tribunal investigator and a potential indictee over the phone. They were having a conversation. And it was complicated because the indictee didn't know that he was indicted in a sealed indictment. So it was a little bit devious, and that was why the interpreter was asked to testify and brought in. So one of the attorneys says to him, "So, sir, are these exactly the words that he said?" And the interpreter said, "Sir, that is verbatim what he said, except through me and in other words." So that was my favorite line that I came away with from the whole book. And in a way, it captures the whole essence of the meaning that we're talking about, this negotiation of meaning, because it's all going through other words. We're all translating everything in other words, and yet we're trying to get across the substance of it. So I'm delighted to receive your questions or comments. Yes?
When you first said that you were translating legal proceedings, I can imagine that if you ever read a legal document, like somebody's estate or something like that, that vocabulary is something that you normally never use. And I'm wondering if you had to deal with that and how you dealt with it.
Okay, the question was, I have to repeat the questions because it's recording, so bear with me. So the question was, how did we deal with the terminology that we were faced with in these trials, maybe legal terminology, very specialized? Well, that's a very good question. And I'll tell you that although the legal terminology was a challenge, it was not the greatest challenge. For all of us peaceniks, it was the military terminology. It was understanding when somebody describe certain things as happening in one of these military reports, what it is that they're talking about. And it's complicated by some terminological issues across the languages, like a word that we thought meant action actually meant fire, like firing on somebody, or there was fire going on in this place or whatever, not fire like a house burning, but people shooting. And so words like that, it took us in some cases years to figure out what these things meant. But we did have some very good single language dictionaries. There's a very good military dictionary, Serbo-Croatian dictionary, which we could at least get some understanding. And there were people who'd served in the military, and we'd sit down with them and say, help us. But one of the problems with terminology is that because our autonomy was so hard fought for, we were not allowed to consult with the author of a text. If there was an author of a text we could consult with. I mean, obviously we couldn't consult with the person who wrote that military report in the field in 1993, but we could consult with people who came in as forensic experts and had written a report on ballistics or political things or nationalism in Serbia or something, and they'd use certain terms, but we weren't allowed to contact them ourselves because there could never be the shadow of a doubt that we'd been pressed into translating something one way or another. We had to make our own decisions, and that was sometimes very tricky. But one of the things that we did early on the attorneys working for the prosecution wanted to understand the legal system of Yugoslavia before the war began. In other words, what was the legal framework within which these people were functioning? What did they think of as being against the law and acceptable? And so in those first years when I first went over there for summers, we were working on this massive amount of the legal code, just translating laws. And I can tell you, that's a challenge. And we developed, as we went, a massive terminological database. So we had about 8,000 terms of words, and then we had another, certainly 6,000 or 7,000 abbreviations. And in military documents, when people are writing up really fast, there's, the shells zipping overhead. They've got their fingers on the typewriter like this, an old typewriter and ratty paper, and they're working fast, and they don't want to spend a lot of time saying the same thing over and over again. So they make up their own abbreviations. And then sometimes, because in Yugoslavia they both use Cyrillic and the Latin alphabet, in Serbia and in parts of Bosnia they use Cyrillic, and in Croatia and in other parts of Bosnia they use the Latin alphabet. And then sometimes there'd be documents where there were both Cyrillic and the Latin alphabet mixed, and we had to figure out which was which in some words, where sometimes the letters repeat, like the P is an R in Cyrillic, and you have to figure, wait a minute, is this a Cyrillic R? Is it a P? And that kind of thing was very complicated. And these abbreviations that they would make up, or ways of referring to a brigade, nicknames for brigades, those kinds of things. We had to work up all sorts of material like that. And it was just a work in progress. I expect they're probably still doing it now. Yes?
About the derogatory language in the previous question, did you have to deal with a lot of military slang that you don't have to decipher but couldn't confer with people about? Or was it not as big of a deal?
So the question was about military slang. Yes, we had quite a lot of military slang we had to deal with. I mean, there was a whole range from sort of military shorthand to, they weren't mostly slangy texts, but they were often just very quickly done, and so just a lot of abbreviated forms and shorter versions of words and sort of hinting at things. And one of the trickiest things for our translators was if a document was ambiguous, it had to stay ambiguous in the translation. And that's something that we don't usually do in translation. We usually choose, okay, this sounds a little confusing, but I'm going to go for this meaning. But we couldn't, because a lot of these documents were intentionally ambiguous, and we had to make sure that they stayed as ambiguous in the English. Yes?
So I recall your chart of how the languages that were interpreted, that were being interpreted and translated to and from. So were there any were there any cases where you had to translate a translation, and then you'd have to, it would be an interpretation of someone's interpretation, and did that cause any challenges?
Well, yes. Well, what happened was, if evidence was, see, the thing is, when witnesses were brought on by one of the parties to testify, they were brought in so that that witness could introduce documents. And the idea, there were eyewitnesses who had actually seen things and experienced them, and they also testified. But there were several categories of witnesses, and the largest category of witnesses were people who had either signed the document that was being tendered, or they had watched it being drafted and were part of the process at the same meeting where it was drafted, or they were an expert in documents like that, and they could speak to the credibility of that document, because the judges had to get to some understanding of whether documents were credible or not, or maybe somebody was just typing them up in some back room for the tribunal and making them up on the spot. And we didn't know a lot of times. I mean, that might have been the case. And so they were trying to, so the witnesses were there to explain the documents and to be there to be asked questions about the documents so that the judges could come to some conclusion about whether the documents were credible as evidence. And that meant we would often get those documents before that day of trial. We would have them all translated and had gone, I would have done my revision, or my colleagues, and then they'd go off as final documents into the courtroom, and then they were given to the people in the booth who were interpreting to use as referential material, since the whole discussion was going to be going on about those documents in the courtroom. So I'm not quite sure if that's what you were asking, but it was the interpreters interpreting in the booth using our translations. Now, we're all part of the same unit, but that didn't mean that the interpreters used our terminology. They were, there's interpreters often have minds of their own, and they are not, and besides, what works in a text doesn't work in the booth. I wrote about that a little bit in the article. If you can have a whole phrase like hygiene and sanitary measures for a sanatia, but when you're discussing it at rapid pace in a courtroom. Every time it comes up, you can't say hygiene and sanitary measures, hygiene and sanitary measures. It's just too much to say. So they went for shorter and smaller things and changed things. So anyway, and also sometimes the defense would have their own translators instead of we're using us. We did a lot of defense translation. And as a matter of fact, the second half of my stay there, we were almost entirely working on material for the defense. But sometimes they would have somebody from outside do a translation. And then there'd be great discussion about whether the translation, they were talking about whether the translation was good or not. Even the interpreters in the booth would be asked by the judges to comment on the translation. There was a hand here, yes.
Did the prosecution ever raise any objection to racial or national background of translators, any bias?
Well, that's a very good question. So the question was, did the prosecution ever raise complaints about potential bias among translators or interpreters because of where they were from? Well, as you can imagine, say you're setting up a war crimes tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and it's your job to go out and hire 50 translators and another 50 interpreters who can work comfortably between Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and English and French. Well, you're not going to find a lot of people other than native speakers of Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian who can do that. It's going to be mainly people from there who are maybe have been in the diplomatic corps as interpreters in the past and are very good at it, but it's not their native language. So it kind of goes against the general rule that you're supposed to work from your own language, work into your own language from the language that you're working from your language. Anyway, into your own language. You're supposed to be speaking your own language when you interpret. And that wasn't the case almost ever. I think we had a few interpreters who were not native speakers of Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, but mainly not. So there was a huge confidentiality regime in place. I mean, not only did we go through metal detectors every day when we went to work and all that, but we weren't allowed to take documents outside the building. We were never supposed to speak to anybody about documents that we were working on. If we wanted to debrief because we were upset about the material that we were working on, we could do that with the person who translated the document, but it was kind of a needs-to-know thing. We weren't even supposed to talk about it with other translators and other people, revisers, although we did consult across the revision room. We were all in the same room, and I'd say, wait a minute, I'm having trouble with this, and someone would say, oh, I had trouble with that last week, this is what I did with it, and we'd help each other. But there was this real, especially early on, this real paranoia. And what's really interesting is that as far as I know, and this is only through rumor because I never saw, nobody ever put down any kind of black and white data about this, but as far as I know, if there were leaks of major proportions, they were always from the prosecution and never from the language unit. And it's really interesting. I don't know why. I suspect that it's probably because the people who came to work there were really proud of working in a situation where they were helping to fight against war crimes, and they hated the war crimes. And if anything, like in this question about the prime minister, president of the government, they were ambitious to be sort of against, they weren't unreliable, quite the contrary. They saw themselves as kind of translator warriors. So I think they they were very serious about it. And also, I learned, I revised. A reviser does about 3 to 4 times as much material as a translator does. So a translator was expected at the tribunal to produce 5 pages of finished product a day. And that's a lot, because there's a lot of research involved and a lot of this kind of researching of terminology and so forth. A reviser, hence, would probably revise about 20 pages of text a day, or maybe a little bit more. And so in my 6.5 years altogether that I did, I figured that I revised about 30,000 pages of translations, and I never had to revise somebody for bias. I never once saw a translator write something that I felt was motivated, except for things like this issue of president of the government, which everybody was involved with. It wasn't one person being biased. And the only place that it did come up a little bit was like the president of the government prime minister situation. Some of these putative war criminals were demagogues and very arrogant and full of all this kind of fancy pronouncements and wild, ridiculous statements. And it's really difficult to translate that kind of a text without it sounding like you're making fun of the person who's your translator. And so we would work at it. It wasn't that they wanted to make fun of them. I mean, they hated the people whose words they were translating, and that didn't help. But we would sit there and go, wait a minute, oh, this is just over the edge, it's making a mockery of it, pull it back, and they'll sound ridiculous enough without you using that extra word. So that was the only instance that I ever came across anything that I could remotely think of as bias. But there was never subversive activity where somebody was trying to slip something through in a document to support their side. If anything, people were much more critical of their own side than they were even of the other. I think there was a lot of embarrassment. I mean, we were seeing awful stuff done by all the parties, and nobody came away feeling that their particular side were saints and everybody else was horrible. So everybody felt that, they were critical of their own communities in lots of ways. And you come away very aware of all kinds of things when you do that kind of work. But anyway, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yes.
So in reading some of these conversations and hearing you speak about this, the role of a translator was incredibly controversial in all of this. How has your decision to write about this and speak about this, and how has that been reacted to, especially considering that some of these things are still going on?
Okay, so the question was, how did my decision to write the book resonate with people that I worked with at the tribunal? Well, one of the things I did, I knew I wanted to do this, even while I was still working there. So one of the things I did right away, as soon as that really clarified itself for me as a goal, was I put out a message to all the translators and interpreters and said, I'm really interested in thinking of ways that we can write about what we're experiencing here that won't impinge on the confidentiality issues that we have to deal with. So let's get together for lunch and talk about this, anybody who's interested. So a bunch of us got together and we talked about it. And one of them also wrote an article, which is in the same issue of that journal that my article came out in. He, in fact, was my boss. And several other them were keen to do it, but it was hard to do, and they had families and whatever, and they didn't. But I wanted to be as inclusive as possible, so it wouldn't be that I was somehow preempting this for myself, because I felt it was our. And then the next thing that I did was I asked permission of the head of the language services, CLSS, to run a questionnaire for current and past staff of the language services and ask their opinion about what was the most challenging experience they met with, what was the most rewarding reason that, for experience of being there, how they talked about the tribunal when people said bad things about it, because the people have been very critical of the tribunal at all different stages, many of them from the hometowns of the people that were working there. And when you go home, how do you feel about it when people say terrible things about the tribunal? Do you defend it? Do you criticize it too? Lots of options. And what about trauma? Do you feel that you've been traumatized by your work here? If so, what would you recommend to somebody else considering taking a job like this to help them to deal with a situation like that? So there were a whole series of questions like that. And it took a while to get my administration to look at it with me. They just were busy, and she didn't really want to deal with it. So I was sneaky, and I wrote a letter to the press office, which coordinates all the requests from reporters who want to write about the tribunal in various ways and sets up interviews and all that. They're sort of in charge of that whole publicity connection. And I said, I'm really interested in doing this, but I don't want to just make a private connection with the people I know in my unit. I want to go through the proper channels. And what that really meant was that then my boss, who was kind of digging in her heels, would get pressure from the press office and realize other people were watching, and then she would feel that she had to do it. I mean, I like her, but she was like, oh no, it's the UN. I was like, oh no, maybe I just should do nothing and she'll go away, sort of thing. And so then I said, well, it just so happens I'm going to be coming through The Hague in April, and maybe we could sit down one day and maybe go through the questionnaire and discuss if there are questions you'd like me to word differently. I'm open to suggestions. And I came in and we discussed it, and there were only 2 little points she had, like partner as well as spouse or something like that, and in one of my questions, and we were done. And then I distributed it to 140 people, of whom 70 responded with wonderful big responses, and I used that in the first chapter of the book. So that helped. And also it was really important because I just had my little view of the tribunal, which was as a reviser, but there were all these other people doing other things, working in the field early on with investigators when the war was still going on, heavily traumatized. There were no psychiatric support at the tribunal at that point, no advisor. Later they got somebody, but at that point there was nobody, people sort of permanently damaged by those experiences, and I wanted to make sure that their voices were part of the project. So anyway, that's how I dealt with it. Yes?
How did you find yourself working at the tribunal? I don't know, maybe it's too personal.
No, it's not too personal. I mean, it's just the way all things happen. Well, I mean, one thing leads to another. So the question was, how did I find myself working at the tribunal? So, as I said, I lived in Yugoslavia for a long time. And while I was there, I was working as a community translator, just translating papers someone was going to give at a conference, or even things like subtitling movies that were going to go to a competition somewhere of movies. Or I one time coached a singer for the Eurovision Song Contest. Does that mean? So that he'd get his pronunciation of his song right in a studio for about 12 hours. So all different sorts of things for years. Well, there weren't very many people doing that in the former Yugoslavia in the 70s and 80s. It was the 80s when I was really sort of known in circles of translators. So there was a woman in Belgrade. I lived in Zagreb, but she was in Belgrade, 4 hours away by car. And we met through a mutual friend, and she did the same sort of thing I did, and we immediately hit it off and had a nice time. And her daughter ended up going to Tufts, and then spent a lot of time at my house in Cambridge and babysat for my younger daughter. And then she went to The Hague and got the job as running the language services. And so she called me up one morning. I just had gotten divorced, and I was about to sell my house because I couldn't afford to repair it. And the phone rang, and she said, "Hi, this is Tina Zoric. I'm in The Hague. I've taken on this job. I'm hiring for the language services. When could you come? How long can you stay?" And it was June, and I said, because she knew who I was, and she knew that I knew my work and that she would be happy to work with me. And I said, well, it's summer. I'm not teaching now. The semester is over. I could come for 6 weeks and we could try it out. And she said, great. You'll just go to the airport in 2 weeks and the ticket will be there and you can just come over. And I went over and jumped right in. And then the next year I stayed for a year. But I didn't stay longer than that. I wanted to go back to Harvard. Anyway, that's how it happened. But it's a small community. And then she was busy pumping me for who did I know of people she could ask from the States, because she knew people who'd lived there, but there were professors here who had done a lot of research and knew the language quite well, and I gave her some names, and some of those people came over as well. So she was looking, just searching as much as she could for people. Yes?
I'm curious how, if at all, this experience sort of informs your role and sort of activities in terms of literary translation. And I was curious also, in terms of the ethical decisions we encounter when we're translating texts, in terms of cultural mediation and navigation and decisions about sort of more on the formal side of things as well. And I'm curious if these kind of ethical decisions that we make when we translate literary texts, how, in what ways are they different or similar to the kinds of ethical decisions you encounter in this kind of job? So I'm curious how those two roles sort of connect, or if they do connect.
Okay, so the question, you can always kick me if I summarize your question wrong. The question was how my experience of working at the War Crimes Tribunal has influenced my literary translation, and how those two different ways of using language and thinking about ethical issues have interacted. Well, first of all, people don't really like to deal with war as a subject, but lots of writers have written about war in the former Yugoslavia. So publishers know that I am familiar with war and that I'm sort of used to those kinds of issues, and so they sent me lots of war-related novels. One of them, Trieste, just came out last year, a big novel, big splash. And some of them are pretty gruesome and pretty awful, and it is true that because I spent all that time working at the tribunal, I mean, it's unpleasant, but I can deal with those texts maybe more readily than somebody who, I won't say easily, but more readily than somebody who has never had that kind of experience as at the War Crimes Tribunal, and then they sit down and look at a text like this, and it just makes them want to weep all the time, and it's hard to translate. So I think that's one piece of it, that I ended up getting a lot of war-related writing. Also, people there, writers, knew that I was at the tribunal, and they would ask me to translate things because they knew that. It's affected me in a lot of different ways, but they're subtle ways. They're not glaring ways. It took me a while to shake off, to loosen up again in literary translation and play with things more. I felt kind of regimented, to use a military term, about my translation for a while, that I had to do things in certain ways. And it just took a little while for me to get more playful and more sort of joyous in the way I was translating. It made me much more, now, just as a matter of course, whenever I make a decision, I'm prepared to defend it. Because I learned that I have to be ready if someone calls me out to say, this is why I chose to do this word this way. And it's just automatic. It's like changing gears in your car. I just do it. I can do it for anything. And so that's definitely came from that. I mean, I never would have thought that way before. And I think that it makes me think about these power relationships much more, because I saw them, as I said at the beginning, so vividly in the courtroom, that it just, like, for example, in thinking about this book, I began thinking about it in terms of power relations. And I just might have translated it as a book in isolation before, but now I think about it in the way it fits into things much more. So I think that would be some of the answers I could give. There's also gallows humor, which is a terrible thing. When you work on really awful material for a long time, anybody who does this, I mean doctors, it's the same, anybody who works it, develops kind of this awful humor, and you can't tell anybody the jokes outside of the room where you work because they're so awful. But there are things that get you laughing so hard that you've got tears coming down your face, and the reason you're doing it is because it's a way of dealing with the trauma. But I have to say the other day, and this is terrible, and so this is another legacy of the tribunal. When I saw that the building in Dubai had burned and that it was called the Torch, I mean, I was helpless. That was the name of the building, the Torch. I mean, it was just amazing to me. And yeah, I never would have thought about that before, but that's the kind of thing where you suddenly see somebody saying something ridiculous, or they say it in such a way that it's ridiculous or something in a document, and then everybody's just like laughing until they weep. And I say, you can never tell anybody else those things, because they're so grim. Yes?
I'm curious about the community that's been created, and you talk a lot about, recommending people who could have worked within this tribunal and having personal relationships with people who were working there, just because this wasn't a wildly popular job at the time, and I assume now. How do you feel being a translator in a language which is not as often in the forefront of the English-speaking world?
We sometimes call those languages of limited diffusion.
Yeah, so how do you feel that, first off, just how is being in that smaller community, in your opinion, positive or potentially harmful? And the second thing is, have you seen that community really affected by the fact that there is so much violence and war that is being requested of them to translate?
Okay, so the question is about the quality of the community, of the people that I worked with at the tribunal, and sort of how that kind of work, what kind of an impact it had on us. Well, in order to really give that a proper answer, what I have to do is just explain something that I didn't go into to explain when I sometimes do, but I wanted to move on to these other things, which is that when a trial proceeds, the logic of a trial is that the prosecution is first. And the reason the prosecution is first is because the prosecution has issued the indictment. So they have their charges, and they know why they have those charges. They've documented them, they've talked to people, they've found out this is this person who did these things, and these are the reasons that we want to charge them. So the first half of a trial is the prosecution explaining to their judges why it is that they're indicting this person for these charges, and substantiating each charge with witnesses and documents. That means that early in the life of the tribunal, when they were preparing the indictments, it was the most disturbing time to be working there, because the documents the prosecution were bringing to build their cases were the worst possible documents. I mean, just the most disturbing documents. But then the trial reaches its halfway point. The judges have determined how many days each half gets, and it goes to the defense half. And then the defense is basically saying, ho-hum, not much really happened that day. It was pretty quiet. Someone shot themselves in the foot so that they could go home or something. And so there's a moment before the trial even begins, just about when the prosecution's about to begin their case, when you have a moment called discovery. And discovery is when the prosecution shows the defense all the documents that they are going to use in their half of the trial. And the reason that they do that, and the defense doesn't do it reciprocally to the prosecution, is that the prosecution has been preparing this case for years before it comes to trial. But the defense only came on board when the indictee was brought in and arrested. And so they come at a huge disadvantage because they don't know the documents, they don't know the evidence, their hands are tied, and they have to build a case sort of playing catch up the whole time. So in order to balance out these inequities in the way the trial is structured, the prosecution discloses all of its evidence to the defense. Well, this happens right before the trial begins, and that's the time that the prosecution makes a schedule of all the witnesses that they're going to call, and the judges set out a calendar for the first half of the trial. Well, you can imagine that this might be something of a logjam as far as the translation unit is concerned, because all these documents that the prosecution wants to present have to be translated and ready to go for discovery. So, and when you've got 5 or 6 trials in preparation, this might be 100,000 pages of documents that have to be done in sort of a month or something. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to, the document flow, the workflow is very difficult to manage in situations like this. So then that's when the really disturbing stuff happens, in this great massive push to get the prosecution stuff out the door and off to the defense. Then the trial begins. At that point, the prosecution's work is done. All their translations are done, all their witnesses are lined up, and they just start to run the trial. During the whole prosecution half of the trial, the defense is preparing their half of the trial. So that means when I came back in 2005 and there were 10 cases running concurrently at any given moment, all those cases had finished their prosecution translation already and were in the defense stage of translating, and we were working for the defense. And that was really hard for my colleagues, translating for the defense. There were times that they really suffered with that. I mean, they did it, they got used to it, but it was hard. So in between 2005 and 2010, those 5 years that I was there, almost all the work we did was defense work. And that's not as disturbing. And it was hard, but again, difficult because you're supporting the defense and support. So anyway, I got into all this. I wanted to talk about community, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to. Anyway, so the people who worked in the early years were really damaged by the work that they did. As I said, they didn't have support, and a lot of them left after those first few years and didn't stay on. And the ones who did stay on just got good at doing it, and because we were all living in The Hague. Everybody had their family in England or in the former Yugoslavia or in the States, and so we were very closely knit as a community, and we supported each other in all kinds of ways. We went to concerts together all the time. We brought each other chicken soup in bad weeks or the flu or whatever. So it was and we're still very connected because the tribunal's now shrinking down. It's in its I forget there's a term for it that they have, but they're pulling back and letting people go. So they've only got 4 trials ongoing right now, so it's a much smaller operation. And so my colleague with whom I worked there, we exchanged emails the other day, and he said there are 12 people left in the English translation unit, where there were before about 60. And by the end of the year, there'll be 4. And that means one of the things I'm going to be doing as of next week is I go to Sarajevo and then Croatia, and then I'm going to Kosovo, and then I'm going to Belgrade and then Novi Sad, and when I come back I'm going to The Hague and then Amsterdam and then Luxembourg and then London and then Berlin to bring people copies of the book who helped me. And they're all over the place because everybody's left from there now, and they're just all over the place, but we're still very connected. Anyway, so I sort of wandered off with that question, but anyway, yes.
I have a question which is maybe the opposite of Siobhan's, which is how do you think that you work as a literary translator, especially for someone like Al-Bahari, who sort of puts forth the idea that language is always slipping out, the meaning of language is always slippery. How do you think that has affected your work in something like the War Crimes Tribunal? And do you think that your approach is different, or your philosophy of language is different than other translators there?
I don't. Okay, the question was, how has my literary translation affected the work that I did at the tribunal? Well, one of the things was that it was healing. I would work on translations when I was working there. And it gave me a sense of agency that there was something I could work on. There was a piece I could do. I could bring a writer's words to the world or something. And that gave, at evenings and weekends, I'd work on translations, particularly al-Bahari translations and a few others. While I was there, sometimes it was kind of, and I had to get permission for each project because any writing or publishing that anybody was doing, working there, had to get approved by my boss and various other people. But I found it helped me. Maybe what you're describing helped me too, the elasticity of language. But it allowed me to be more regimented when I was at work. But most of the people that I was working with closely were pretty proficient translators themselves and had done all kinds of translation, maybe not al-Bahari, but other writers. And so one of the things that they brought to my understanding about just even literary translation is just sort of, the whole business of loosening up and playing with it and stuff, and that came out of a lot of our interactions. But I'm not sure that the literary translation that I did, more the fact that I wrote a textbook about the language, I was thinking about the grammar in tricky situations, that I'd sort of gotten in further among the people who weren't native speakers of the language than the others who were English and so forth, because of doing the textbook, maybe. We still have some time if there's more. Yes?
I was wondering if you were asked to participate in another war crimes tribunal, would you do it again?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the question was, would I work at another war crimes tribunal again? No, I don't think I would. I think I was really ready to come back when I came back. I could have stayed. I could have stayed until now, until this summer when I turned 62. At the UN, you have to retire when you're 62, so isn't that amazing? Or at least it was for my generation. I think people coming in later, they could stay later. But I chose to come back for a number of different reasons. But one of the reasons was that sort of I really needed to be doing something else. I couldn't do that anymore. And it was partly compounded by being so far from home and from my kids and from who were grown up and often working and stuff, but still I wanted to be closer. But it was also just needing the intimacy of family life. I think that's one of the hard things when you go off to a place like that and work there. You're cut off from many of the people I worked with were cut off from the normal sources of support, like someone that you come home and have dinner with in the evening. So I think that also makes it difficult to do that work for a longer time. And no, I don't. But I think I would help other people who were interested in doing that kind of work and give them guidance and be happy to do that. And there are war crimes tribunals around. There's the Cambodian tribunal called the ECCC. There's the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague. The ECCC is in Cambodia, but the Special Tribunal for Lebanon is in The Hague. There's the ICC, of course, the International Criminal Court, which is also in The Hague. There's the Rwandan Tribunal, but it's wrapping up now. That's also finishing. That's the phrase, completion strategy. The UN is always big on these phrases. So the Rwandan Tribunal is also coming to an end. But there are these various tribunals. And there'll be continuing to be some things, but I do have a theory, which is not what you asked, but it's sort of something I've been thinking about, so I'll just toss it out here, which is that they made really big indictments for these trials that I was involved with, and the trials themselves last for 3 years, 4 years, sometimes long trials. And sometimes people grandstand a lot in the trials, and they use the trials for their own political promotion, and there's a lot of abuse and manipulation that goes on by the indictees in various ways. On the other hand, this idea that they should have a proper defense and not be like Nuremberg, where it's all just kind of a show trial. So there's a lot of tension around how much leverage to give to the defense and how big a defense and how much do you let them grandstand and push their political goals and try to get their supporters so that when they finish their term, they can go right back into office and promote the same things that they were promoting during the war. And so I noticed that when Saddam Hussein was taken prisoner, they had a very short trial. And I'm quite sure, I'd be willing to put real money on this, that they were entirely motivated by seeing how long our trials had been. Sometimes people die in the middle of the trial, like Milosevic, and it's a big mess and expensive and everything. So they found one massacre. They chose one massacre, 200 people killed, I think, for the Iraqi trial. And they tried him on that one massacre of 200 people, and then they put him to death. So that was sort of, let's do this quicker. Now I think they have a much faster method, known as drones. They just kill people right there on the ground. They just don't give them the opportunity to grandstand. They don't do anything. They just kill them right there. And I think that this is a succession that is related. I think that the drones came out of frustration with the big, clumsy, expensive trials that we have. I'm not enthusiastic about drones, but I think that I think it's directly related. Like, oh, let's not encumber ourselves with these people who are just going to talk about their ideology and get more people fired up and be counterproductive. Anyway.
Can I ask?
Yes.
I'm wondering if you have plans to translate your book. I know it's not even out. It'll be out on Friday, but do you have thoughts about?
Well, the question was, do I have plans to translate my book, presumably into Croatian? But, well, first of all, I don't translate into Croatian. There are other people much better equipped to do that than I am. I write in English, and I'm happier doing that. I mean, I can write in Croatian. I wrote my dissertation in Croatian, but it was a long and agonizing process, and I don't intend to do that. But the problem with translating this book into, you saw, well, in this, if you look at the sheet under derogatory language, and you have actual transcripts from the courtroom. So I have lots and lots of examples of these in my books, of examples of discussions in the courtroom. So there was an interpreter interpreting this into Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian in the courtroom when it was being read. And if the Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian transcript had been made, then one could just find this segment and put it into the book directly from the courtroom transcripts. But they did not create, which is a whole other story, transcripts of the languages of the witness and the accused. They only created French and English transcripts. And there are recordings of every session, but that means that for the probably 300 or 400 places that I quote, you'd have to take that day of court and then listen until you find the text recorded from the booth of the interpreter interpreting into Bosnian, Croatian, or Serbian, and then transcribe that piece from the transcript and put it in the book. And then when you did that, you'd discover that no longer did that segment illustrate the point that I was making, because it was different. Because it's a translation, or it's what the witness said and it's different from the English translation. So then you'd have to comment on the differences between the English and that. And so I actually wrote about this on this issue of the fact that they did not produce transcripts. Recently there's been a project to retroactively create transcripts from the recordings, which in itself has been quite controversial because some of the transcribers just transcribe exactly what's on the recording and other ones correct things. And then there's, well, what's corrected, what is, I don't know, it's a big discussion. But in any case, you know, you can easily imagine at the beginning of the tribunal, there they were putting this thing together. They had to get booths with all the interpreters. Well, could they get stenographers who could actually be real-time typing down everything that people were writing in Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian? And what about whether it was Bosnian, Croatian, or Serbian? And should they be doing it the language of the witness or the language of the accused? And sometimes they were different languages, Bosnian one, Serbian another. So it got very, very complicated, and they just said, oh, we'll just do English and French. And then the interpreters were interpreting, and whatever they were interpreting is the transcript. It's just not on paper. It doesn't exist anywhere. But there are about 1 million pages of transcripts in English and French on the ICTY website where I got all these quotes. And you too can go there. It's just, if you just look up ICTY, or International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, you'll come right to the website, then you pick a case, and when you open up the page related to that case and go down to the bottom, you have dates, lots of dates, and each one of those is a day of court. And it's about 80 to 100 pages per day of transcript. So if you have 300 days of trial, It's a lot of things to read, but you can do searches. They have searches on the website. You can put in a word like interpreter or other words, and there's too many references to interpreter to make that worthwhile, but you can think of a word and put it in and see what comes up and see different trials and then find that trial and go and read some of it, and it's very interesting. It's addictive, I can tell you. I spent 4 years doing it. Okay, yes, you, and then you, yeah.
I was very interested at the moment when you were mentioning about the importance of adding footnotes or specific comments about the different terms that they were being used. And I was wondering what would be your opinion on the footnotes used for translating literary texts that were presumably using the same terms, for example.
Right.
And that some people may argue that it would be needed to be illustrated for the reader to really understand the consequences of the voice.
Right.
Of the characters, the narrators, etc.
Okay, so the question was about footnotes in literature as opposed to, say, footnotes or annotation at the tribunal. Well, that's an interesting question, and one we talk about a lot among us, ourselves as translators. If the original that I'm translating uses footnotes, I translate their footnotes, and those are footnotes. Whether they're at the bottom of the page or at the end of the chapter or the book is a matter of the publisher, but I would, use the footnotes. If there aren't any footnotes, and yet there are things which has often happened in books that I've translated, which are culturally very specific and need explanation, I prefer a glossary, because if you have a term that comes up 5 times in a 300-page book, and the third time you've forgotten what it meant because you read it on page 25, you can't remember what page you read it, and so you're leafing back through the book to find the footnote. I think it's much easier to have it. This works if what you've got are just a series of references to like a historical person or a place or something. That works well in a glossary. There are certain things that don't work as well in a glossary, like a commentary on what's being said or something like that you couldn't put that in like an encyclopedia type format, but you can. But I prefer, generally, I'll use a glossary if I can. But I, as many translators do, try to, if there's just an easy one-word reference that I can use to clarify something, I'll try to clarify it in the sentence if I can. There is that issue that if it was just a book back home with just a bunch of pages and writing on the pages and no footnotes, you want to have as close to that experience as you can possibly have for your reader reading it in the translation. But on the other hand, and what I think is really interesting is that this is really different in Europe than it is here. So I have a very good friend who's an excellent translator in Zagreb, and she feels that people, and this is a kind of a thing about cultures not being equal. So she feels, they want to understand everything in the English text. They want every little joke, every little reference, every little cute little thing. They want it explained so that they can understand America better. Whereas we coming to Croatia or Serbia, it's all strange and different, and sure you want some things, but you can just accept it being strange and different. And so it's not an equal exchange, to quote a theorist. Oh, and yes, you had a question. Sorry.
Sorry to take so much of your time and attention, but I'm curious, you had spoken a little bit about giving, how you were willing to give guidance to people who are interested in translation and tribunals, but standing in a room full of young people who are interested in translation, and as someone who referenced having worked, with someone on their pronunciation for Eurovision versus literary translation for Al-Bahari versus working in the tribunal, what kinds of advice do you trend towards offering to young people who are interested in translation but don't really know where they want to turn?
Okay, so the question was, what kind of advice would I give to starting translators? Okay, so I have advice, which is that I learned with this experience at the tribunal. Not everybody pays as well as the UN, but if you want to actually make your life as a translator and raise a family and buy a house, you should work for an organization that hires you as an employee. And this is increasingly difficult because there's so much outsourcing done. There's so many people working out of the house. Now, it's nice to be able to work from your house. It's terrific. But there are big disadvantages to it, like benefits that you don't have, and I mean, health insurance is very expensive for freelancers, and it's hard to break in, and everybody, because it's now a global market and these translation agencies are situated all over the world, they can get people very cheaply. So they're really happy to pay you 5 cents a word, and you can't make a living at 5 cents a word. There's just no way you can actually make a regular living. So you have to start at 12 to 15 cents a word, and you have to find, you could freelance if you can work for 15 cents a word or above, but otherwise I think it's much better to do one of two things. One, work for a company that uses a lot of translation, the way I did at the Tribunal, or the UN and other places, or big international companies, or a bank. I mean, there's lots of places that use translators. Find out where those are and get a job with one of them. The disadvantage is that you end up translating bank texts all the time, but it brings you into translation and you can make your living doing it. Or get another job and do your translations on your weekends and in vacation and in the evenings with a glass of wine. I mean, and then you don't have to think about making money off of it, and you probably won't. I mean, I've gotten, I don't know, okay, $3,000, or the most I've ever made from a book that took me about 7 or 8 months to translate was $11,000. Now, if $11,000 is coming in when you've got another job and you're doing it on weekends, that's a nice little bit of gravy, and you can take a nice vacation and buy presents for your children. But if you're hoping to actually make a living, $11,000 for 6 months of work is not an adequate salary. So, and that was from a big, major New York publisher, you know, and that's, so like, I know that's the most I'll ever get from a literary translation, unless something I translate becomes a bestseller or something, but then you only get a tiny percentage anyway, so that's unlikely that you'll ever. So either way, you know, a lot of people who are literary translators also teach. Some of them have spouses who make a lot of money, and then they do their translating and whatever, or you work at a company and have a regular salary. But that would be my recommendation.
Well, I think that that was a great question, Jen. Thank you for asking that. I think everybody appreciated it, and thank you for that very frank and useful answer. I think that kind of practical advice is really valuable. And your discussion was just as wonderful as I had remembered the last time. So thank you so much. And can we all thank Dr. Bursac? It looks like some people haven't signed up on the sign-up sheet, so I'll leave it at the front table for you to do so on your way out. Otherwise, we look forward to reading your responses. We look forward to seeing you again next week.